Brought to you by the Astro Youth House chapter from STEM Arts Lab, Space on Earth is a student-led podcast that inspires listeners who are curious about space to explore the wonders of the universe through the voices of young thinkers, creators, and dreamers.
Each episode blends personal curiosity with scientific discovery, from the mysterious depths of black holes to the practical impacts of space on Earth, like GPS, climate science, and medicine.
Hosted by STEM art students from Taos, New Mexico, this podcast draws connections between space, art, and science, how these things all impact us here on Earth, and their meaning to humanity.
You'll hear raw, insightful conversations about topics like light pollution, the overview effect, lunar exploration, and the societal impact of the space race.
Whether you're into exoplanets, dark energy, or just stargazing from your backyard, Space on Earth makes space personal, accessible, and inspiring. We believe that space isn't just for astronauts and scientists, it's for everyone.
Join us on this adventure as we explore the cosmos from Earth, one story at a time.
Special thanks to the Lore Foundation for helping launch this podcast.
Hi, I'm Taylor Strite.
And I'm Shaylee Merrill.
And I'm HattieRose.
Today we're going to be talking about the amazing things that you can see with your own naked eye from your backyard. We're going to be going over constellations, the moon, planets, meteor showers, and satellites, and how they've appeared throughout time and how you can see them on your own.
So starting off with constellations, Taylor, Hattie, what are some of your favorite constellations?
Personally, one of my absolute favorites is Orion, and that's for a couple of reasons. I like the mythology behind it. And that mythology actually relates to another one of my favorite constellations, Scorpius, which I'll go into in a second. I like that it's easy to spot in the night sky, and so usually I can kind of navigate other constellations through it. And the star Betelgeuse, which is one of the brightest stars in Orion, is very easy to see. First, I want to go over a bit of what exactly is a constellation. So constellations are a very old concept where people would look into the sky and could find patterns and name them and draw figures out of them. And so this could be for a lot of reasons. It would be for navigation of, you see these three stars in the sky, you go in that direction to get to wherever you're going. So when we didn't have a lot of navigation systems, the stars were very helpful and constellations became a part of that. And then also it was used a lot. You look at folklore of old myths being told, old stories that tie in with the shapes and symbols behind constellations. And they've stayed very relevant kind of through. Astrology is a really big thing with constellations, how we still look at the sky and how we map out and name new discoveries. So that kind of goes over what exactly we mean when we talk about constellations. Shaylee, HattieRose, would you guys like to add anything to that?
Going off of just the constellations and all the different stars in the sky, how they are used for different sorts of mapping and figuring out where you are. We sort of inverse that now. And so now scientists, they look up at the sky and they use those constellations, specific areas of the sky. And so if you wanted to look at the constellation Orion, they would use the constellation Orion to map out a certain area of the sky instead of just looking anywhere in the night sky. They'd look specifically at Orion to see what's around it, what can they see around it, what does the constellation Orion have to do with a particular spot in our night sky.
Thank you for adding that. I brought up how Scorpius and Orion are related. I want to go into that for a second. So that goes back to an old Greek myth, and that kind of puts into perspective of how old a lot of these constellations are and, how amazing it is that we can still see them today and we still refer to them the same way that people did hundreds of years ago. So the original story states that Orion was a very great hunter who was very proud in his abilities and was very boastful about how many animals he defeated. So the gods sent a scorpion to kill him. And if you look in the sky, they're on opposite sides of our sky. You can see Orion during the wintertime, you can see Scorpius during the summertime. And so it's said that as they move through the sky, they are forever chasing each other. And so that really puts into perspective kind of how all these old mythologies that we still use today when we think about constellations, which is really that combination of the technical and scientific aspect of it versus like traditional and mythological. Do either of you have any favorite myths or stories related to constellations?
Sure. I think that all the constellations that are related to Greek mythology are pretty interesting just because I've learned a lot about those. Like you mentioned Orion or like Hercules. There's also a ton of different ones. Like in Chinese mythology, Egyptian mythology, Native American legends, all that kind of stuff. So I think constellations are really cool just because they go across all different types of like cultures and years, like decades. They've been here for since the beginning of, I guess, humans. So I think it's just a really big part of who we are.
Yeah.
And Shaylee.
And so when we look at constellations in the sky, what we see is very limited. And so there's a difference between the northern and southern hemisphere constellations. If you're in the northern hemisphere, we're looking into a certain part of the sky. But, say in South America or Australia, they're seeing a completely different night sky. And so as older societies were looking at the stars and using that for mathematics and science and folklore, you're going to have different constellations corresponding to different societies throughout time.
So I think it's, as I mentioned before, pretty interesting how different it can be all over the world, even now, like even in modern times, how people can view constellations and it's not the same for everybody. It just depends on like where you're at in the world, what you can see, what culture you're in. So I know that Greek and Roman cultures have pretty, that's like the most common constellations, but there's also Chinese and East Asian cultures, which has a bunch of different constellations as well, which is really interesting. And I like how there's like that variety. Do you want to talk a little bit about the moon and how that relates to the constellations, Taylor?
Yeah. So the moon, so for me, kind of the immediate connection that I make is I get this sense of when I look up at the constellations, and I've brought this up, of how incredible it is that we're looking up at the same patterns that people did hundreds of years ago. And the moon's the same thing. It's been a very consistently throughout history an important part of the sky, especially because, we see the same face of the moon. And so, there's people, early humans who are looking up in the moon and seeing that. And then people who are making some of the first astronomical calculations looking up at our moon. And we have the first time that humans stepped foot on the moon back in the space race, which was extremely significant for history and our country as as a whole. And that's even the same moon, and that's the same shapes and view that I'm seeing from Taos, New Mexico, and growing up here, that I've seen that throughout my life, and it's been such a thing. So there's definitely that connection that I make. And the moon is so significant for humankind. We base a lot of our calendar, growing seasons, people use it to clock a lot of things because it's constantly there. You can see it, you can kind of rely on it. And so our month is based off of the moon. It's the lunar cycle. You can kind of hear similarities in the words. So a lunar cycle from, say, full moon to full moon is about a month because that's what we base our calendar off of, which isn't, it's not exact, but that's roughly what's based off of. And it's a really big deal for farming throughout history before, we had printed calendars and our calendar apps and stuff to say, oh, this is like good planting time. People could look up to the moon and record that. So that's really interesting. Shaylee or Honey Rose, do you guys have anything that you want to add about significance of the moon?
I think like the phases of the moon is really interesting, especially because it's so connected to us, especially like with how Earth's gravity and moon's gravity like kind of works together to change the waves, which directly affects us, obviously. Shaylee, have you had any experiences throughout your life where the moon like really meant something to you or it like really stuck out to you in your past?
Typically with the moon, I just like how Taylor mentioned, growing up in Taos, the moon is just always there. It's a constant. It's always so bright and it always lights up the sky. For me specifically, I don't think the moon, there isn't necessarily any memories I hold specific to the moon. I know that me and my friends were always able to just go out in our backyards, look up at the moon, and just see the different phases. We're able to see it just as it comes up over the mountains. And just, although it doesn't have any much personal significance to me, just like how Taylor said, it has a lot of significance to people just all around the world. We've used it for so many different things. And it's just been something that stayed constant throughout a lot. It's something that stayed constant for so long throughout wide periods of time. I can always go up, look at it, and it's something that people are always able to base certain things off of.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, I love looking at the moon and it's so every now and then I take the time to think about it that there is this giant rock in the sky and we get to look up and see it at night when the sunlight hits it and it's glowing. And it's beautiful and it's so incredible. And it's one of those things that there's a lot of things about our moon that's very interesting in the way that things line up. So, for example, one of them is the speed at which the moon rotates on its axis and the speed at which it orbits the Earth are like their relationship with each other makes it so that we only see one side of the moon. Plus, there's the size of the moon and the difference between that and the size of the sun compared to the distance between the moon and the sun. And that's why we have perfect eclipses and things like blood moons, which I've seen and they're incredible. And you get you get experiences from that. Hattie Rose, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. So quickly building on what Shaylee said about her personal experiences, I remember when I was younger, I would go camping a lot in Taos. And growing up in a bigger city with a lot of light pollution, it was pretty hard to truly appreciate the stars and the moon just because it was so hard to see them. So when I would go to smaller cities like Taos and I'd go camping, we would just sit out at night and just admire how beautiful the moon was. And I remember when we go on like week or month long camping trips, we could observe the changing cycles and phases of the moon, which was really fascinating. And I think building off of what you said, Taylor, about how we can see like this rock in the sky, I think it's also really interesting how, even though it's a little bit harder to see with the naked eye, you can see it through telescopes and things like planets, which is even more fascinating, especially because it's like balls of balls of gas in the sky, which is really, really cool. So I think that's really nice as well. Do you guys have anything that you want to add about planets?
Just with the most immediate connection I think of when I go from the moon to planets, the first thing I think of is just the planets are also another constant, although we're not able to see them nearly as much as we're able to see the moon. They're also something that stayed constant throughout time and something that we can always see if we look up at the sky, although it's a lot harder to see them and make them out.
Yeah, so the planets are, it's something I've always been very interested in. And so when in the case of looking up into the sky from your own backyard and looking with your naked eye, the planets are also, we kind of tie this back to constellations. You you can see different planets in different constellations, and it's really cool how they line up and how you can kind of find different planets with constellations and vice versa. You can use the planets to find constellations. And so I do kind of want to, real quick, for our listeners, recommend in this episode, we're talking about all these different things that you can see in the sky from your backyard. But it's a little difficult if you don't know exactly where to look or what you're looking for. Luckily, we live in an amazing age of technology where you have apps in your phone that can help you find these things. One of my favorites is Stellarium. Another good one is Skyview. Both of these you can use for free, and you can look into the sky and find what we're talking about tonight. For example, using the planets to find constellations, right now we have a few different planets that we can see. So you can see Saturn, Venus, Mercury in the morning, you can see Jupiter and Mars at night. Use you can see most of these with the naked eye. It depends on where you're living, how much light pollution there is. Tonight is a new moon when we're recording this, which means that it is a great night to go look at stars and planets and try to find things. But in terms of using planets to find constellations and vice versa, Orion's a pretty recognizable constellation. A lot of people can spot the belt. If you look at Orion kind of up and to the right, you'll be able to see Jupiter, which will look like a bright star. And then above that to the left, you'll be able to see Mars, which will also look like a star. It's just a bit redder. A main visual difference is stars twinkle a lot more than planets, just because of the distance.
So that's a good lead in to talking about meteor showers. Because if they go out tonight to look at the stars, they might see the meteors.
So speaking of the new moon tonight, there's also going to be a meteor shower. Have you guys heard anything about that you want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I can definitely talk more about the meteor shower. And specifically for tonight and for the upcoming weeks, there is the Eta Aquarius meteor shower. It's been active since April 20th, but it's going to continue going on all the way up until May 21st. Currently, we have yet to reach its peak or the best night to see the meteors. The best night or the peak of it is going to be on May 5th and 6th. And so that's going to be the time where you're going to be able to see the more meteor showers, more meteors going through the sky, and they're going to shine more brightly. And so just a little bit about the Eta Aquarius meteor shower. It's actually named after the constellation Aquarius. And so if you're able to look up at your sky and see the constellation Aquarius, that is where the meteors are going to be most likely. That is where you're going to most likely be able to see those meteors. And just for a little brief overview, Taylor, do you want to explain more in depth, like what is a meteor shower? How do they happen?
Yeah,
And
of course.
like
So meteor showers a lot of times are caused by comets. So what's important to know is that there's a difference between a meteor shower and a meteor falling to Earth. So when we see a meteor, like a shooting star, a lot of times those are random, unrelated incidents of one rock. Meteor showers are a little different. Meteor showers are large groups of these rocks that we're going to see in the sky, and they happen at the same time, same point in the sky every year. So, what happens with a meteor shower is when a comet is going around the sun, think about Halley's Comet, any of these, they leave behind trails of ice and dust and gas and rocks. Those they stay in the same place in the sky. as we're moving around the sun, we pass through a lot of these trails and this debris. And we see it at the same time every year. And we see it coming from the same part of the sky. And so the meteor showers that we can see, like the Aquarius ones and the one in August, they're named after which constellation they look like they're coming from. So Orionids, meteor shower, for example, look like they're coming out of the constellation Orion. And so that's how you see them a lot easier. So that's kind of the difference between the two of those. Shaylee, does that answer what you were looking for?
Yeah, that definitely answers everything that I just a quick overview. I also know that now there's also another meteor shower that's happening. Although its peak has passed, it's still supposed to be somewhat visible. So currently now we're like on the last little bit of the Lyrid's meteor shower, and that is around the constellation Lyra, which is a harp shaped constellation.
Can I add something real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
What you're saying about Lyra, one connection that I made as you said that is kind of at the beginning of this episode, we were talking about how constellations tie together with the Greek civilization. If for listeners who are aware, a lyre is a harp. It's imagine like a harp shaped like a horseshoe. That was very common back during that time. So a lot of times constellations aren't just named after stories, they're named after objects too. Wanted to add that real quick.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Like you said, Taylor, the constellation Lyra it does represent a lyre, which is a musical instrument that is associated with Greek origins, and it's specifically towards a Greek poet, Orpheus, who suffered a loss of his wife, Eurydice. Yeah, and so it's tied back to another Greek origin, and so I just find it really interesting how a lot of these constellations can be tied back not only to Greek stories, but also just other objects within the Greek time. And specifically for the Lyrids, though, we're right at the end, right at the cusp of when these meteors are going to be able to be seen. Hattie, do you have anything you'd want to add?
I don't think specifically on showers, but I think we should definitely go into talking a little bit more about satellites. Since we did mention a little bit about like looking at the moons and the planets in the sky. Have you guys ever noticed any satellites in the night sky before?
I have the one that I have seen is the Skylink satellite, and that one's actually pretty noticeable and distinct when you see it. It looks like a moving line of lights. So that's a really interesting one to see. When you a lot of times when you see a satellite, it can kind of look like a meteor, but they move a lot slower and they don't twinkle. So that's kind of how you tell a difference.
Interesting. I think it's also fascinating how satellites can be called constellations, even though they're not, just because they're so like bright. Like it almost feels like you're looking at a meteor, but it's not, which I think is really fascinating. Have you guys ever seen those pictures of like all the satellites that surround Earth right now? Even just
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting. And there's so many. I think even, is it Skylink or Starlink? There's so many, and it's right outside of our atmosphere.
hmm Yeah, they're close. And
Mhm.
talking about the groups of satellites being called constellations, that's really interesting because it kind of brings in the topic of modernizing the way we look at space around us. And, you know, not too long ago, you could look in the sky and you wouldn't see man made objects. And now we do, which really represents the technological advancements we've made in space, that we have man made objects up there and how that's kind of shaped and changed the sky. So we have really contributed to our night sky, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's like really cool how we're now like a big part of space. Obviously, there's so much out there, but I think it's interesting how far we've gone, especially because like 100 years ago, we hadn't even left the atmosphere. And now we have like things installed, which I think is just really, really cool.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how we have made different technological advancements that have allowed us to change what we see up in our own skies. Because, like Taylor said before we were able to just see the stars, the moon, and different planets up in the sky, but now there's certain things up in the sky, such as satellites, that can sometimes cause a little bit of confusion between, oh, is that a star? Is that a new constellation? Or is that just something that we put up there? Is that something that we're mistaking for a constellation or for a star?
Thank you. And kind of another thing I want to bring up is we're talking about man-made objects and satellites in space, and that being how we're part of it. But then also think about how we have the International Space Station up there, which sometimes you can also see with the naked eye. So that's, we have people in the night sky. So that's a really interesting connection to me. And I like thinking about kind of how our relationship with the night sky has changed over time between it, from early scientists and astronomers thinking of it as very far away, mystical, mysterious thing, to now knowing all that we know and interacting with the night sky. That's really fascinating to me. So I think that for tonight's episode, we've gone over kind of what we were going to talk about. As a quick thing that I want to bring back up for listeners is I would recommend, Google night sky maps. Use apps like Stellarium and Skyview and go out tonight, look at the sky, see what you can find, and just see what connections you can make for yourself.
Thank you so much for listening to podcast.
Thank you for listening. I'm Taylor.
And I'm Shaylee.
And I'm Hattie.
Good night, and we'll see you guys next week.